finally have our race weekend here in Bahrain. Finally, the start of the 2024 season. And we're going to go into my track preview and predictions on what's going to happen in the Bahrain Grand Prix, what type of tires they're going to use, how the cars are going to be set up, and who will be the victor, with also the top 5, and the teams that are not going to do as well. I hope you guys enjoy the video. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe and like. That would mean the world for me, and I'm going to try and continue this as long as you guys love this series. Then I'll keep it going throughout the whole season. Let's get into the track preview. So Bahrain is a tricky one, being that it is the first race on our calendar. It gives us a good preview of how the cars are going to look like. This is a pretty much medium downforce track, so the wings are going to be at a medium pace and give us the best look of how the cars will look like throughout the season. Now, one thing that's always known in Bahrain is the tires get shred up here very easily. And why is that? Well, the track itself doesn't get cleaned very much, and it is in a desert area, so the sand likes to get picked up on the track, hard to clean, and that actually makes for a little less grip than usual on these A1 tracks. The tire compounds that they're going to be using is going to be C3 to C1, which is the hardest compounds that we have on the season. Sometimes the C0 is used, not very commonly. It's a extremely hard tire, and on a track like this, C3 to C1 is important to use. What we'll see in the race, we typically see a 2-stop in the race because of the tire shredding. So the hard compound sometimes gets used, depends on what the teams go for. Maybe we see a medium, hard, medium. That's what I suspect will probably be used for this season, especially with the amount of curbs that drivers are using going into this Grand Prix. As for traction and asphalt grip, I already said it's kind of a slippery track when it comes to the actual sand falling onto the track, but traction should be still okay here, and the teams are going to rely a lot on the rear grip of the car. It's a more rear limited track, especially turns 1 and 2, and really consists throughout the whole entire track. The rear is really important here, so if your car doesn't have a good rear, usually you're not going to be great here. Let's go over the sectors and where the overtaking zones are. As we start at the starting line, going into Sector 1 down the main straight, this is where you will hit your highest kph with the DRS open. It is a DRS zone, and a popular overtaking zone is Turn 1. I'd probably say the most popular on the track because of its hard braking, but also how you can set up going into turns 2 and 3. We've seen a lot of famous battles here. Back in the day, Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton. We just recently saw in 2022 Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, and it's always going to be a trend because it's a hard braking zone and it makes for a lot of sparks going into turn 1. Now, setting up turn 1 going to 2 and 3 is really important because you have to nail the traction to be able to get the best exit to go into the long straights to go into turns 4 and 5. Now, this is also another overtaking zone. We have seen Leclerc specifically set up a couple of beautiful DRS moves from 2022 on Max Verstappen here, and we could see that trend yet again if Ferrari is close enough, or if Red Bull is somewhat lacking. We'll have to see, but this is a overtaking zone, just not as popular as turns 1. And then we go into the Sector 2 section of the track. Now, this part of the track is actually very important for how your qualifying lap will be. It's got a lot of traction zones. It's very important on rear grip. Hitting those braking zones and not actually locking up is essential to getting a great lap, especially going into the famous Turn 11. Now, why it's famous is because Fernando did a beautiful overtake. I'm joking. It's actually famous because it's such a hard braking zone. It's a bit downhill, and you have to almost nail that to get a great lap time. The exit is essential on this part of the track, and it's very rare we see overtakes. Fernando pulled off a beauty, but it's not something that's very common here, mainly just getting good traction and on the exit, and you could possibly set up a move just like Fernando did on Carlos Sainz in 2023. It's very rare we see that. That's where we get into the more high-speed section of Bahrain. We go through these turns in a high speed, usually full out. It would be a big problem if it's not full out for the drivers, especially in qualifying. Maybe in the race you might have to lift a little bit, but high speed. Going into another straight here in Sector 3. This doesn't really provide that many overtakes because of its high speed section and continuing into the speed. You also don't have DRS, and mainly moves are set up from Sector 3 going back into the start finish line. And that makes up our Bahrain track with a lot of its history. Let's get into the predictions for the video. As for the predictions in the video, I want to go over my top 5 predictions, top 5 drivers in the race. Then I want to go over the top 2 teams that I think will perform the best here on this track. I'll do the top 2 worst teams, and I'm going to do a biggest surprise on the track. Now, this is all dependent on drivers and the cars, and we don't have a good idea yet of how all the performance is going to be. So as we go through the season, my predictions will become much more accurate to what we're actually seeing on track. Right now, it's a bit of a guess. It is a prediction anyways, but it's a bit of a guess to what we usually get to see after seeing a couple of Grand Prix and seeing how the cars perform. Let's get into my top 5. And I'm going to do it from 5 to 1. So at number 5, maybe it comes to a shock to some people, I'm going to put George Russell. George Russell is going to be my number 5. I think the Mercedes car has a lot more performance than it's showing, and we'll just have to see that on track. At number 4, I'm actually going to put Fernando Alonso. I'm not going to put him on the podium, but I think they've been hiding a lot of race pace. They did everything in their best power to actually hide the performance of the car. And I do think that that battle between 1 to 5 will be very, very close. And I do have Fernando just jumping up in 4th. I do think it's going to be a big battle to get any of these positions. Maybe first place will be a little bit out of reach, but that's the only one that I'm talking about. At number 3, I have Lewis Hamilton. I think Lewis is getting a podium in the first race. I'm telling you, this Mercedes car has more pace than I think more people are thinking. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. I do think the Mercedes has more pace than it's actually showing, and it does seem like James Allison is pretty confident they can beat the Ferraris. But speaking of Ferrari, I have Leclerc in 2. And you might add, where's Perez, where's Carlos? Well, I do think that these two drivers are actually going to DNF. I think they're going to hit into each other. That's kind of my little crazy prediction for this. But as I said, a prediction, we don't know. We have no idea whether it's going to happen or not, because I think those two drivers could compete for the top 5, especially in the RB20, and the SF24 actually looks pretty good. But I'm going to put Leclerc in 2 and Max in 1. I do think it's going to be a close race. I think that Max will take the lead for most of the second half of it. I do think Leclerc will jump him in the beginning because of qualifying, and then from then on, Max might have a more controlled race, but I think it's going to be very close between really the 4 teams that we have in the predictions. We have Mercedes, Aston Martin, Ferrari, and Red Bull. I think all these teams are very close, and I think McLaren is just edging, but it seems like they're a little unconfident, so that's why I'm not putting them in the top 5. Now let's go over the top 2 best teams I think on track. I do think the Red Bull will be the best on this track, and I think race pace wise, I think the Mercedes is going to top the Ferrari. I think the Ferrari overall will be the second team, so I'm going to put those 2 as the top 2 teams. But race pace, I'm going to have Mercedes just a little bit edging the Ferrari. Top 2 worst teams, maybe you've guessed it, maybe you haven't. I'm going to put Haas, obviously, the Butter Shredder 3.0, but I do think the car is going to be much more improved than what it was. They actually had a good testing program, so I'm not going to give them too much doubt as to whether they can come back in the season, but for them to actually perform here would be rare, especially on a track with this much tire degradation. I just don't expect Haas to be that great here. And the other team that I have is actually Alpine. And I feel like everybody's talking about it, that Alpine's going to be a bad car. It's overweight. They've also been notorious for being really bad in Bahrain. 2023 was just your perfect example. 5-second penalty for Ocon, 24/7. Probably will happen again. We'll have to see. The Alpine car isn't necessarily great here in Bahrain. And my biggest surprise, if you haven't guessed it, is going to be Lewis Hamilton on the podium. I think that would be a shock for us to actually see Mercedes in the podium because they've hidden so much. So I'm going to say Mercedes is going to be a really good car here, but they could be completely off the pace, and I'm completely wrong. That's kind of the beauty of these predictions, especially going into the first race of the year. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Please give me a comment on your top 5. I'd love to see what you guys think for the top 5. Am I overambitious with Mercedes and Aston Martin? Am I thinking, is McLaren going to be better than I thought? Will Perez and Sainz finish the race? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please comment down below. Give it a like, subscribe. We're going into the season. I'm super happy. We should have an upgrades video very soon on the Bahrain Grand Prix, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all so much for the support. Please leave a like, subscribe. It'd mean the world, and peace.